Hi, welcome to Cafe Tudunai. Today we're very happy and honored to have Dr. Les Greenberg. Dr. Les Greenberg is a distinguished professor from York University, but more importantly, he's one of the most important clinicians of our time, and he's the founder of emotion-focused therapy. Hi, Dr. Greenberg.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're really happy to have you. And we want to learn more about therapy, emotion, and your life wisdom. So you are one of the most important clinicians of our time. Did you always grew up wanting to be a psychologist?
No, not at all.
No.
I I was an engineer first, so I actually have a master's degree in engineering.
Huh.
So I changed into psychology when I was 25 years old and already post-masters.
Wow.
So I didn't always, psychology was not in my frame of reference initially. I wanted to be a nuclear physicist.
Wow. Nuclear physicist.
Right.
How did you transform from a nuclear physicist to a psychologist?
Right. Well, there's a funny step along the way, which is I became an engineer because I went to a guidance counselor when I was 17, and I liked working with people. I had been in leadership roles in my student days. And so they said to me, rather than becoming a nuclear physicist, you should become a nuclear engineer
Okay.
because engineers work more with people than backroom scientists do. So
Okay.
I went into engineering, but I hated machines. I, I was I was into, mathematical and more conceptual kinds of things. So I really became an engineer because I liked working with people, which in and of itself is a paradox, right? Uh, but then I left. I was born in South Africa, and all
Okay.
that occurred in South Africa. So then when I left South Africa, I came and I did a master's degree in Canada. But at that time in the 70s, there was a move towards exploring inner space rather than outer space.
Hmm.
I was taken with the whole movement, and having left countries, I'd been very politically involved in fighting against apartheid
Hmm.
in, against South Africa. So it was a big change. And my wife was a psychology graduate, so I knew something about that from her.
Hmm.
And I actually decided to go to India to an ashram for a year
Wow.
because I couldn't figure out what to do. But then at the last moment, which I can tell you about if we want to go there, I got accepted into a PhD program in psychology.
Huh.
And so it was a big shift because I was trying to get more personally relevant in what I was doing.
Uh-huh.
So I shifted to psychology. And once I got into psychology, I found my true path.
Wow. So from nuclear science to India and then to psychology, I'm trying to put these three things together. Or maybe even today, quantum physics may start have some linkage to mind. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm trying to understand how did nuclear
Right,
science
right.
to
I, I
India.
I don't think it wasn't the nuclear theory, of physics to psychology. They were different,
Oh,
right?
sure, sure.
So it was really that I was seeking greater personal relevance. I'd been quite involved in anti-government protest
Hmm.
in South Africa, so I was quite socially involved.
Yeah.
And I came to Canada and I was looking for greater personal meaning, greater personal relevance. And because my wife was a psychologist, I knew something about psychology, and I was always interested in working with people.
Uh,
So I would have made that shift. But having a scientific background helped me in psychology, but it wasn't at the level of nuclear science.
Well, actually, I know when I was a grad student, like if you have a strong math or science I think even today, if you have a strong math or science background, grad program do like you or prefer you more in general.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. And that's why I was accepted straight into a PhD in psychology because I had this strong math and science background.
right, right. I can understand that a little bit because when I was undergrad, I was a chem major and I like physical chemistry, things like Schrodinger equation. I mean, I learned some of those hard science. So those background did help me when I go to grad school and learn about scientific research. So I
Yes,
assume that's some of the advantage you have when you went into your program.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
And they just took you like that. You just walk in, you just apply and say I'm a nuclear scientist, and
Well,
then
I had gone through the official channels and they told me I'd have to do 3 years of undergraduate work and all that. But but I knocked on the door of Laura Rice, who became my mentor,
huh?
and she was a student of Carl Rogers, who was
Yeah.
a well-known therapist. And she wanted somebody who could mathematically model moment by moment interactions
Hmm.
between clients and therapists. So I had these mathematical skills. So then they said, you've got a master's degree, you can come into a PhD, but you need to do 1 year of makeup studies.
Okay.
So I did a little bit of first year psychology, some second, third, and fourth year.
Uh-huh.
So 1 year, and then I went straight into the PhD program.
1 year is not bad. It's a nice discount for three.
Exactly, exactly.
Wow, wow. So it seems like you found a very important mentor who's like, Carl Rogers' student, who's the humanistic approach. Was that the approach you always liked to start with, or it's just happened that way?
Yes, no, definitely. And had I gone to some other psychology department or some other professor, I don't think it would have worked out. I
Hmm.
mean, as an engineer, I was already reading existentialists.
Oh, wow.
And I was also familiar with behaviorism and with psychoanalysis. And I rejected both psychoanalysis because it was too dark and too
Hmm.
deterministic.
Hmm.
And also, I rejected behavioral psychology and learning theory as too simple and
Hmm.
also too externally driven.
Right.
So I was a humanist as an engineer in terms of my philosophy of life,
Interesting.
that people choose, that their projects determine who they are, that they're responsible for their own
Hmm.
um, fate, so to
Hmm.
speak.
Like we're the
And also,
author of our life, kind of.
exactly, we're also
Uh,
our own lives. And also, I was struggling with meaninglessness or what is meaning. I've always struggled with what's the meaning of it all. And I was doing that as a 17-year-old. Uh,
the big question.
that's right.
Who am
Right.
I? What's the life is about? Where am I going after I'm dead?
Exactly, exactly. So I always had this sort of existential humanistic view.
Ah,
Um, and then I just clicked with Laura Rice. And she was the first adult who I felt, who I trusted. At that time in North America, it was
hmm.
like don't trust anyone over 30. There was this whole hippie movement or the sort of countercultural movement. But
Sure.
In South Africa, it was even worse because every adult, either actively or passively, was somehow a supporter of the what I saw as the evil regime.
Hmm.
So I really didn't believe that they had anything to offer.
Hmm.
Uh, I mean, they had technical things, if they were scientists, but as human beings, they didn't have a lesson to teach
Hmm.
because they were distorted themselves. So Laura Rice became sort of the first person who she began talking about empathy,
Hmm.
the importance of listening. And I began to feel I could really learn from her.
Hmm.
And that started my whole path.
Yeah, I think Carl Rogers' ideas are not just meant for individual, but it's also meant for society, right? I mean, we should develop empathic understanding towards others, unconditional positive regard. And seems like being a social activist is something you're quite interested in, even before you become a psychologist.
Yes, yes, yes. And yeah, I mean, what really impressed me was this idea that most people don't listen in conversations. They are thinking of what they're going to say next.
Right.
And we used to give our students, when I was already beginning to teach or be a teaching assistant, we would give our students the exercise to go out and listen to conversations in the cafeteria and see whether people really listened to each other. And they didn't.
That's such a
Um,
great assignment. I'm going to ask my students to do the same.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it starts to impress you about the whole role of listening. Recently, I did a workshop in Cyprus.
Hmm.
They made up, one of these bags that you carry, and it has a saying on it. It's actually in my background,
Hmm.
and it
Oh,
says, "Emotions speak.
huh.
Do you listen?" And I love that.
Motions speak. Do you listen? Interesting.
Right. Emotions speak, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you listen?
Yeah, yeah. And which I guess that remind that lead to one of my question, which is you're known to be an advocate of listening to people's emotion, change people's emotion. How did you come to that position from like Rogerian approach?
Yes, even more, how did I come to it from being an engineer? You know, Initially I valued math and science as the pinnacle of intelligence, and I aimed for that. But by the time I got to around 40, I began to realize that, there are many intelligences, and the emotional intelligence is much more important for living than is mathematical intelligence and so on. So I started off with meaning
Hmm,
being my central idea, and that also came out of
sure.
existentialism, this sort of man's search for meaning and the importance of meaning.
Hmm.
But I think there were two sort of factors. One was my own emotional life.
Hmm,
I couldn't, even though I was trying to be very rational and was very rational, I couldn't deny that emotions played a very central role
hmm,
in my life and in my marriage. Um, and yet I was trying to control them and was afraid of them, essentially, right?
hmm,
And then also I was observing videotapes. Well, at that beginning, it was audio tapes.
hmm,
So I was engaged in research. I was interested in investigation, not only in helping, but in understanding how helping works.
hmm.
And so I was watching lots of tapes. And I was also in a Gestalt therapy training
Okay.
where there was a lot of emotional expression going on. So I witnessed both on videotapes of therapy that when people began to experience their emotions more deeply, it got more authentic, it got more productive.
Hmm.
New things happened or changes occurred. And then I was witnessing all the emotion going on in these groups that I was in. But I was also theoretical, and it was like, but none of these approaches, Rogers or Pearl's in Gestalt therapy,
Hmm.
had a theory of emotion. They had different theories, but not a theory of emotion.
Hmm. Right.
I started trying to read. Now, I had read Polanyi, Michael Polanyi, who was a Nobel Prize winner, I think, in chemistry, and then he became a philosopher.
Oh.
And he wrote a book called Personal Knowledge. And the essence of that was that knowledge is a very personal and passionate thing.
Mm-hmm.
Science is not objective. There's a lot of emotional involvement, but that essentially we know more than we can say. And in my final year of engineering, I had solved a math problem, which no one else in the class solved, but I didn't know how I knew how to solve it. So I became fascinated with this idea that I know more than I can say.
Mm-hmm.
And so eventually that became, well, emotion is what's going on inside of me, and it tells me things. But there was not a clear theory of emotion. There were different theories of emotion, but they were like you get rid of your emotion,
Right.
or your emotions, in Rogers, your emotions will lead you to be more authentic. And that was similar, but there still wasn't a clear understanding of emotion. So I started reading voraciously everything on emotion. And at the time in 1970, when I entered psychology, there were only 3 books on emotion.
3? Wow.
Now in 2020, let's say, there's an exponential increase in the publication on emotion. And it's like I've been part of a paper in which says, are we in the age of affectivism, of affect? There was the cognitive revolution, and now there's the affective revolution.
Right. I mean, when I was a grad student, emotion is not the key focus. Usually, I guess the most popular approach, even today, is cognitive behavior approach. So I wonder how do you deal with this major force in psych field?
And this major force was one of the reasons that I developed emotion focused therapy. Because when I started off, I didn't plan to create a therapy, but the dominance of CBT, which was slowly eroding all other possibilities in all graduate programs, CBT was being taught. I felt it was essential to stand up and say this dominant narrative, just like in South Africa, the dominant narrative which oppressed, that this was a dominant narrative that was oppressing truth in a sense, because I just couldn't brook the idea that thought produces emotion.
Right, that's the dominant explanation that we often learn, yes.
Right. So there was Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And I was saying, and not only me, it's much more, I feel, therefore I am. If we didn't have feeling, we wouldn't be alive. So it really was trying to get a rightful place on the podium for both the humanistic approaches and for the importance of emotion.
Must be must be a challenge if you are like proposing something new to against the dominant narrative in the field.
Right. Yeah, I mean, a metaphor, I do have a theme of struggle, of struggling against. And it has been a struggle. I mean, there's a lot of power and economics and politics involved in academic,
Sure.
in the generation of knowledge or truth, or call it what you will, right? Yeah, so it's been a struggle.
Sure. But I mean, we're thankful that you're able to stand up and provide a new way of dealing with human struggle, and your work also helped me to sort of pay more attention to why emotion is important in therapy. So maybe this is a good time we let our audience know a little bit about your emotion-focused therapy. Like, what is it, and what is the view of EFT on human struggles? Like, why do we struggle in life based on EFT's perspective?
So essentially, I mean, the view is that emotions are evolutionarily derived or developed in order to help us survive.
Mm-hmm.
So that our emotions work to help a survival tendency. So they give us information without saying a word. They give it to us through our bodies, and they're giving us information about whether our needs are being met or not being met.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, the first important thing is to not view emotions as bad and disruptive, but to understand that basically they're healthy and that they give us information about how we're reacting to situations before we ever think, so that our emotions orient us to the world. Fear orients me to escape.
Mm.
Anger orients me to puff up and thrust forward to protect my boundaries. So each emotion gives us an action tendency and a meaning. And so awareness of our emotions is very important for healthy living. But then emotions were first called passions because passion really means we were passive. They happen to us. They come without any bidding. When you stand at the graveside of a loved one, the tears just come, right? So emotions happen to us. And then particularly the Western mentality of logical, rational control, which was so sort of supported in society, people start to try to control their emotions, to not have them, because they happen to you, and they're happenings rather than things that you will. So then people start clamping down on their emotions, especially when they have painful emotions. So in therapy, we need to help people deal with their painful emotions, which they're trying to protect themselves from. They have a fear of dangerous emotions. These emotions are going to overwhelm me. I'm going to drown. They're going to annihilate me. I won't be able to function if I feel my sadness. My shame will lead me to such humiliation that I just can't go there. So there's a lot of protection. Now, in other approaches, they talk about defenses against emotion or avoidance of emotion. I talk about protection, that we protect ourselves. So we're trying to cope, but it's a misguided attempt, and we try to do that by not feeling. So we're helping people approach their feelings rather than avoid them. We're helping them become aware of them, tolerate them, symbolize them. So go ahead.
So if I understand correctly, part of the reason why people feel, I guess part of the reason why we're diagnosed with psychological disorder, for example, it has something to do with our maladaptive emotion. And the goal is to learn to, I guess one problem people have is also not even aware what are the emotion or feeling they have. So part of our job, right?
So you see, there are two things we're talking about there. One is awareness of emotions. The other is that emotions can be maladaptive, because I first said emotions are healthy,
right?
And you need to be aware of them. But then we talk about, you can't just talk about emotion as a singular phenomena. That you have to talk about different types of emotion in all science. Depth, like with a microscope or a telescope, always looking deeper. So we have to think about emotions as having levels, and we also have to think about emotion as having sequences.
Okay.
So now we have different types of emotional processes. And what we talk about is we have our primary emotions, and those are the very first emotions that I feel in a situation. I walk into a room, I see people, and I have a feeling. I either feel safe, I feel anxious, I feel angry, something happens, and it all happens very rapidly. Uh, this is my primary emotion.
Okay.
But then we often have some fear of that primary emotion. And so we have what we call secondary emotions. And these are the emotions that come secondary. So anger is the best example. When people feel primarily hurt or vulnerable, they often get angry. Well, that anger is not the first emotion, it's a down the line emotion. And underneath the anger is actually the feeling of shame, or underneath is the feeling of fear or hurt. And then we also have something we call instrumental emotions, which is the way people use emotions to sort of make an impact on others. I can cry crocodile tears in order to get your sympathy.
Right.
So we have primary, secondary, instrumental. But now, when we get to your primary, your very first gut response, is it healthy or has it become maladaptive because of traumatic life experience? Right? So then we can come to our very primary emotion, and either we can trust it and follow it as a good guide, or we have to understand that it's no longer adaptive and we need to change it. The big thing that EFT said that's different is that we can actually help people change emotions. Every other approach changes something else. They change thoughts, they change motivations, they change interactions.
Right.
But I'm saying you can change an emotion. And then the issue became, how do you change an emotion?
Right.
And I have proposed and done some research showing that the best way to change an emotion is with another emotion.
That's your famous quote. Change emotion with emotion, which this is the sort of the most interesting part of your EFT, right? Is how do we change emotion with emotion?
Right, right. And if you think about it, fear leads you to want to run away. You can't control it. It just happens. Your heart starts racing, your muscles get organized to run away. But if you feel sad or you feel compassion or you feel angry, those are all more approach emotions. So immediately your body organizes to reach out for comfort or to give comfort or to protect boundaries. So you can't run away and you can't avoid an approach at the same time. So now you're in a condition of you have two competing intentions and action tendencies within you. And I'm saying that there's a transformation by synthesis, not by learning, but two different things within you synthesize to form something truly novel.
So I understand you have one emotion, you want to change it with another emotion, but it's not like replacement, but it's more like, I guess, one Lego piece, another Lego piece, and somehow we put them together to a new Lego piece.
Exactly. If you put, I'm colorblind actually, but if you put yellow and blue together and you get green,
Right. So
which is truly novel development, right?
it's an emotion cocktail.
You're right. If you think in terms of cocktails.
That's where my mind's going right now.
Right, right. So there's a blend, and the blend creates novel experience. So if you feel shame, if you were abused by an alcoholic father and you're left with feeling fear and shame. You think of this alcoholic father or your childhood, and your body organizes automatically into this withdrawal kind of action tendency and feeling. Then, if I can help you to feel empoweredly angry, right? I deserve to have a childhood free of violence.
Mm-hmm.
I deserved. And I'm sad that I never had a childhood that was free. These new emotions now blend with the old emotions. So you think of your father now, you don't automatically withdraw, you also start feeling stronger. And the anger and the sadness blend with the fear and the shame. You may end up feeling stronger, confident.
Mm-hmm.
You may feeling compassionate to yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess emotion, if you use it correctly, or if you blend them in a new way, create a new result. I'm like a Buddhist, and then we're from Buddhist tradition. We often have things like if anger, if you use it wrong way, versus if you use it right way, could mean very different thing. So anger without hatred could even be compassion to oneself. Like it's like if you blend them correctly. Am I on the
Yes.
right track on this?
Yeah. And I think, I'm pleased you brought up anger because, initially the Buddhist tradition seemed to say anger is always bad. But I think that's just not true. But as you say, there's primary empowering anger, which can be good anger. And it's interesting, anger without hatred.
Yeah.
And then secondary anger, which is reactive anger, and
Mhm.
it's usually wants to destroy or to do damage, whereas assertive anger is just having a voice.
Yeah. In the Eastern tradition, emotions are wonderful tools to help others if you
Yeah,
use it correctly. And
yeah,
also in the Eastern tradition, you also have different meditations, sort of like what you're saying, use emotion to change emotion. So if you have hatred, you practice compassion, compassion meditation.
exactly,
Yeah.
right.
All right.
So
So there's that perspective.
yeah. And I mean, there's definite similarity between EFT and Buddhist traditions. I mean, also Gestalt therapy had absorbed sort of some Zen Buddhism.
Mhm.
So there were meditational practices which were called awareness practices, which I was trained in, and
Mhm.
the notion of presence and presence to others, and as well as yourself. So there's this a definite compatibility between the Eastern traditions and
Yeah.
EFT.
Yeah, I think one of the best thing about modern time is like information are so free flowing, and then you get to sort of it's almost like learning different martial arts. You start to learn to integrate different
Yeah.
style of therapy, and then you learn something from each other. And
Yes.
so from EFT's perspective, then I guess for our audience who don't know much about therapy in general, then what EFT does is to help us to, I guess, to become aware of our primary and secondary emotions and learn to transform, modulate it, and gain some kind of corrective experience out of that change.
Yeah. Yes. And the corrective, there's also the relationship is very important. So when you have a new emotional experience with another human being, it changes the old. So if you feel shame and you actually have another human being who's compassionate to your shame,
Mhm.
start to absorb the compassion and not feel so uh, painfully alone, so that that is one form of emotion changing emotion, where the emotion comes from another human being through the relationship. The other is you generate the emotion from within.
Hmm.
And what we found is that awareness of need is helpful.
Awareness of need.
Yes. So that what happens in therapy is firstly, you protect yourself against, let's take shame as the example of a painful emotion that developed because you had a father who humiliated you and shamed you. So you're very vulnerable to feeling shame. If your boss just looks at you crookedly, you start to shrink and feel inadequate, right?
Yeah.
So then if I can take you back and actually help you have an imaginary dialogue as a child, imagine that you're 8 years old and here's your father. And first we have to actually evoke the shame. So the person, you have to feel it to heal it, right? You
Feel it to
can't,
heal it. Okay.
you have to feel it to heal it. You have to arrive at a place before you can leave it. So you have to feel the painful feeling, not talk about it. You
Right.
actually have to feel it. So we have to bring that feeling alive. Now, of course, that's painful and people want to protect themselves against it. So the support of the therapist, the development of a collaborative alliance with the client, that they understand why it's helpful, that the only way out is through. You have to go into the emotion. But now it's not just enough to go into the painful shame. We now can get to what did that shame need? Or what did you as the 7-year-old need? I needed a father who validated me. I needed a mother who protected me. And then we help by validating it. So you really deserved to just have a childhood free of violence. Of course, that's what you needed. So we validate that need. Then the person starts to feel more deserving and more empowered. Yes, I deserve that. And once that happens, the emotional brain, which works before conscious thinking, kicks in. And essentially, the emotional brain says, I deserve to have safety. I didn't get it. I feel angry that I didn't get what I deserved. And I feel sad that I missed out on getting what I deserve. And maybe also I feel compassion to myself for having had to suffer that. So now we produced a whole new emotional state, and that's what helps to change the feeling of shame. So that's the type of process, and the need is often very helpful to help people start to feel deserving, that they deserved certain things that were missed, and this helps generate new feelings.
I think that's a wonderful example for our audience who kind of don't know what therapy is about. Otherwise, people, sometimes people think of therapy as like Woody Allen, like the Woody Allen syndrome, where they could talk about their childhood, they could draw a diagram on why they're messed up, but is keep talking about it without nothing change.
Right. Yeah, so EFT is what's called an experiential therapy. You have to actually experience things. Talking about them doesn't lead to change. So you really have to feel it in order to heal it. But it's not just enough to feel it. You have to feel it and then go through a sequence of new experience.
Yeah.
New experience changes old experience.
Feel it to heal it. That is such a wonderful way to remember your approach. What is your vision for our future therapists? Now, since we talk about your personal transition, how do you feel where the field should go?
Well, I belonged to and was part of the original group that formed the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration. So I do believe that each therapy approach has something to offer, but that the problem is we're in a state of what has been called school wars or religious wars of schools of therapy.
Sure.
My vision for the future is that we will have a more empirically based approach to therapy in which we will teach how to work with emotion, how to work with cognition, how to work with behavior, how to work with motivation. It's more like in medicine, you have physiology, anatomy, neurochemistry, that we will be talking about processes. And I think emotion, cognition, motivation, behavior are all important and different ways of working with them. So eventually the future clinician will learn how to work with all of these and then be making decisions to what works when with whom.
More process-based, less tribal.
Yes, exactly. So it's a very strong, we need to move towards processes and really understanding change processes. So in around 1986, I proposed what was called change process research. It never really took because outcome research, became dominant. That's another struggle that I've been fighting all my life, is the importance of research on processes, not research on horse races between which therapy is more effective than which other therapy.
Sure. Of course, there's a lot of different forces that are pushing for the horse race kind of research.
Yes.
Yeah.
But in terms of for future therapists, I just hope and trust that emotion will be a strong player on the processes, because I believe emotion is the fundamental datum of human experience. That's what really comes first.
Yeah. Makes sense. All therapy should focus on emotion. I think that's a very reasonable vision.
Yeah. I was just going to say, yeah, when I'm in social situations, people ask me, and I say, well, I work with emotion. They say, doesn't all therapy work with emotion? And I say, unfortunately, it doesn't. It's really interesting. I mean, there was behavior therapy, cognitive therapy, motivational therapy, interactional therapy, but not emotion therapy.
Yeah, it's very indirectly or just brush to it. Yeah. This is such a wonderful conversation. I personally learned a lot just, by talking to you about emotion, EFT. I never had any training in this, so I would definitely read up more about it. Any book you want to recommend to our audience if we want to learn more about emotion and focus therapy?
I think for the general audience who are not necessarily therapists, there's a book called Emotion Focused Therapy, Changing, I've even forgotten the subtitle, but it's Changing Emotion or something along that line. That was written more for people who maybe are in helping professions, but not for therapists. There's a book called Changing Emotion with Emotion.
Okay.
A very recent book, 2021. I mean, that's good for really understanding how to work with emotion.
Definitely get that book on my Amazon right away. Changing emotion with emotion. Would that be your take-home message? What would be your take-home message for our audience today?
I think my take-home message is maybe what's put on that bag that I talked about. Emotions speak. Do you listen?
Emotional
Right.
speak. Do you listen?
Right. That, really paying attention to emotion, understanding that they're very important. And it's a little bit like emotions are like the red light that go on the dashboard of a motor car to tell you that something's wrong in the engine. So emotions are often telling you what's wrong or what's going your way, and you need to pay attention to them, not ignore them and try to put them in a box. You really need to pay attention to your emotions.
So emotions speak. Do you listen? That's such a wonderful way of concluding our conversation. Thank you, Dr. Greenberg.
Thank you.
And I hope you enjoy our conversation. If you want to learn more about Dr. Greenberg's approach, check out his new book, Changing Emotion with Emotion. Every month, third Friday, 7 p.m. Stay tuned.